My name is Marisol Navarro. I am 31 years old and I used to believe that if I worked hard enough, quietly enough and long enough inside my father's world, he would eventually see me as someone who belonged there. I was wrong. I found that out on a Tuesday evening in March, sitting at a dining room table that wasn't mine yet, across from the man I was going to marry, while my father told his family that I was a criminal. But I should start before that night. Before the county recorder. Before the deed. I should start where most of the damage started, in a house I grew up in, with a father who had a very specific idea of what a daughter was for. My father, Rodrigo Navarro, built Navarro Property Holdings from a single duplex he bought with borrowed money in the early 90s. By the time I was in high school, he owned 14 units across 3 neighborhoods in the east side of our city. Not an empire. Not a fortune. But enough that he had opinions about how things worked, and he shared those opinions the way some men share weather reports, constantly and without being asked. I was the second of 3 children. My older brother, Dante, was the one my father had groomed from the beginning. Dante understood the business in the way my father wanted him to, as a matter of birthright rather than competence. He could walk a property and tell you what the curb appeal said about the seller's desperation. He could read a contractor's estimate and find the padding. These were real skills and I don't take them from him. But Dante also understood from a very young age that our father's approval had a shape, and he fit himself into it the way water finds a container. He was never wrong in front of our father. I was never right. My younger sister, Paloma, was the baby, and she was handled differently, softer, more indulged, kept out of the business conversations entirely. She went to school for interior design and married early, and my father spoke about her with a kind of relieved tenderness that he never once directed at me. I went to school for accounting. Not because anyone asked me to. Not because my father suggested it. I chose it myself at 17 because I had been watching the books at Navarro Property Holdings since I was 14 years old, not officially, not with any title or acknowledgement, but because my father's bookkeeper at the time was inconsistent and I was precise and I noticed things. I started flagging errors in a notebook I kept on my own, a spiral-bound thing I bought with babysitting money, and one evening my father found it on the kitchen counter and flipped through it without asking. He didn't say anything to me about it directly. What he said to my mother in the hallway outside the kitchen was, "She's been going through my business papers again." That was the first time I understood that my usefulness and my welcome were 2 completely different things. I went to school for accounting anyway. And I told myself at 14, standing in that hallway hearing his voice carry through the wall, that if I was ever going to be in a room where my word was questioned, I was going to have something in writing. A notebook. A ledger. A record with dates and my signature at the bottom of every page. I graduated with honors from a state university 4 hours from home. I sat for the CPA exam the November after graduation and passed all 4 sections on the first attempt. The pass rates for those sections run between 40 and 60% on the first try. I am not saying that to impress you, I am saying it because my father's response when I called to tell him was, "Good. Now you can help Dante with the books." If you're watching this right now and you've ever brought something home, a grade, a promotion, a license you studied for, and had someone in your family treat it like a receipt they didn't ask for, I think you already know the feeling I'm describing. The way the air goes flat. The way you recalibrate in real time quietly so no one sees you do it. I recalibrated. I said, "Sure, Dad." I drove home the following weekend and I sat with Dante for 3 hours going over the property accounts. Dante thanked me. My father did not. Act 2. The first time my father called me a liar to my face, I was 24 years old and we were standing in the parking lot of a title company on a Friday afternoon. He was refinancing one of his older properties, a 6-unit building on Callaway Street that had been carrying a high rate since the early 2000s. I had found the refinancing opportunity myself. I had run the numbers, compared 3 lenders, drafted a 1-page summary showing him the difference in monthly payment and total interest cost over the remaining loan term. The savings were significant. He moved forward. On the day of signing, I drove to the title company because he had asked me to be there. I thought he wanted a second set of eyes. I wore a blazer. I brought a copy of the loan documents with my margin notes. When I walked in, Dante was already seated next to my father at the table. There was no chair set for me on their side. There was one chair against the wall slightly behind them, like a waiting room seat that had wandered into the wrong room. I sat down in it. The loan officer walked through the documents. My father signed where indicated. At one point, a fee appeared on the closing disclosure that didn't match the lender's original quote, a processing charge $212 that I had specifically asked the lender to waive in an email 3 weeks prior. I had the confirmation in my phone. I said quietly, that fee was supposed to be waived. I have the email. My father turned and looked at me the way you look at a radio that's been picking up static. Then he looked at the loan officer and said, she gets confused about what she's actually confirmed versus what she thinks she confirmed. The loan officer glanced at me. Is that something you'd like to look into before we proceed? I said, I have the written confirmation right here. I held up my phone. The email was open, the lender's name, the date, the fee waiver in plain text. The loan officer read it. She looked at my father. It does appear the fee was agreed to be waived. My father said, I'll handle it after closing. He turned back to the documents. I set my phone face down on my knee and did not speak again. The fee was not corrected that day. I went home and sent a follow-up email to the lender myself and had it reversed within 48 hours. I told my father. He said, I was going to handle that. That was the register he operated in. Not loud. Not theatrical. A consistent low-frequency signal that said, your version of events is not reliable. Your contributions are either invisible or they are someone else's ideas that you've gotten confused about. You are useful but not trustworthy. You are present but not quite real. The cruelty was always social. It was always delivered with a kind of mild organizational concern, as though he were gently correcting a misunderstanding for everyone's benefit, including mine. He never yelled. He never called me stupid. He questioned my memory, my accuracy, my judgment. In front of contractors. In front of tenants who came into the office. In front of my mother, who would sometimes look at the floor when it happened and sometimes look at me with an expression I could never fully decode, somewhere between apology and confirmation, as if she were sorry but also needed me to understand that he was probably right. The worst instance of that period happened at a family dinner about 6 months after the Callaway Street closing. My father was discussing an acquisition he was considering, a small commercial strip he'd been watching for 2 years for units, one anchor tenant with 18 months left on their lease. He was at the head of the table laying out his reasoning, and I listened, and when there was a pause I mentioned that the anchor tenant's lease had a personal guarantee clause that would follow the sale, which meant the liability profile was different from what he was describing. I had read the lease summary. He had shown it to me himself 3 weeks prior and asked me to look it over. He looked at me across the table and said, "Where did you get that from?" I said, "You sent it to me." The lease summary. In October. He shook his head slowly in a way that managed to be almost kind. "I don't think I did, Mija. I think you're mixing that up with something else." Paloma looked at her plate. Dante reached for the bread. My mother said, "She's probably just misremembering." I squared my fork against the edge of my plate and said nothing. 2 days later, he called me to ask about the personal guarantee clause. He did not reference the dinner. He asked the question as though it had just occurred to him. I answered it. He said, "Right, good. I'll look at that." That was the year I started keeping records of everything. Act 3. I kept records the way some people keep diaries, not out of anger initially but out of self-preservation. If my memory was going to be challenged, I was going to have documentation. If my contributions were going to be attributed to confusion or coincidence, I was going to have timestamps. I bought a dedicated notebook for the properties. Not a spiral-bound one this time, a hardcover ledger with a cloth spine, the kind an accountant would use, because I was an accountant and I was finally going to treat my own work as though it counted. I dated every entry. I noted the property, the task, the outcome, and any communication that preceded or followed it. Within 8 months, the ledger had 43 entries. The first cluster was Callaway Street alone. I had identified the refinancing opportunity in February of that year. I wrote the date I first pulled the rate comparison, the date I drafted the one-page summary, the date my father told Dante about the refinancing as though it were his own idea. I wrote that date too. I didn't say anything about it. I just wrote it down. I had managed the bookkeeping for Navarro Property Holdings without a title or a salary for 3 years at that point. I want to be precise about what that meant in practice. I reconciled 12 accounts across 14 units every month, rent rolls, maintenance expenses, utility pass-throughs, and the 2 separate reserve accounts my father kept for capital improvements. I filed the quarterly estimated tax payments. I corresponded with the property management software company when their reporting module broke and lost 6 months of expense data. I rebuilt that data from bank statements and contractor invoices over the course of 2 weekends, alone, without telling anyone what had happened, because I knew my father would have blamed the software and the lost time equally, and I didn't want to hear it. I handled the audit correspondence when the county assessor's office flagged 3 of the properties for a routine review. I prepared the response documentation, organized the supporting schedules, and submitted everything within the deadline. The assessor's office sent a clearance letter. My father mentioned it to his accountant friend at a golf event as something his people had taken care of. I trained the new bookkeeper he hired in the summer, a young woman named Sandra who was genuinely competent and who asked me, privately after her first week, whether I was an employee. I told her I was family. She looked at me the way you look at something that doesn't quite add up and then decided not to push it. I coordinated 3 lease renewals across that same period, 2 residential, 1 small commercial, drafting the renewal letters, negotiating minor term adjustments with tenants directly, and presenting final terms to my father for signature. He signed. He did not ask how the negotiations had gone. He did not ask what the tenants had originally pushed back on. He signed and moved on. The second incident I remember from that period with the specific, preserved clarity that I think only happens when something lodges in you before you fully understand why, happened on a Saturday morning in early spring. My father was meeting with a contractor about a roof replacement on one of the residential buildings, a 4-unit on Mesquite Avenue. I was there because he had called me the night before and said he wanted me to take notes. I took notes. The contractor presented 2 options. My father asked about the warranty on the membrane for option 2. The contractor gave an answer that I recognized immediately as inconsistent with the product spec sheet I had pulled up on my phone while he was talking. The warranty he quoted was 15 years. The spec sheet said 12. I waited for a gap and said, "The product sheet shows 12 years on the membrane warranty. Do you have documentation that shows 15? The contractor looked at my father. My father looked at me. He said, "Let's not get into the weeds on that right now." I said okay. I wrote it down. After the contractor left, my father looked at the notes I'd taken and said they were thorough. That was the word he used. Thorough. Not useful, not good, thorough, the way you'd describe a student who'd followed instructions adequately. I drove home and wrote the entry in the ledger. I also pulled the contractor's license number and checked it against the state database. It had 2 unresolved complaints filed in the previous 18 months. I sent my father a summary. He thanked me and used a different contractor. He did not mention where he'd gotten the information. By the time I was 28, I had logged contributions to Navarro Property Holdings that spanned 7 years. Refinancing research and execution across 4 properties. Full bookkeeping and tax compliance on an ongoing basis. Lease coordination across 6 units. Audit response that saved the portfolio from a reassessment that could have cost real money. Contractor vetting that had twice prevented what I believed would have been expensive mistakes. None of it had a title attached to it. None of it had a salary. None of it had been acknowledged in a room where acknowledgment would have meant anything. What it had was a ledger with a cloth spine, dated entries, and my signature at the bottom of every page. Act 4. I met Cristobal at a continuing education seminar for real estate professionals. He was there because his family, the Fuentes family, owned a small residential portfolio on the west side of the city, 12 units, modestly run, nothing like what they'd eventually grow it into, but enough that he was trying to learn the language of the business properly. I was there because I was always trying to learn the language of something properly. We dated for 2 years before he proposed. Long enough that both families had met, had eaten at the same tables, had formed opinions about each other. His mother was warm to me in the way that some women are warm to you when they've decided you're serious and competent and will not embarrass their son. His father, Eduardo, was reserved but fair. He asked me questions about my work and listened to the answers. My father, by contrast, received Cristobal the way he received most things he hadn't chosen himself, with a surface-level approval and a low-grade vigilance underneath it. He liked that the Fuentes family was in property. He liked that Cristobal had a practical mind. But I understood from the way my father introduced Cristobal to his friends, that Cristobal was being presented as something my father had arranged rather than something I had found. When Cristobal and I decided to buy a house together before the wedding because we were practical people and the market was doing what the market does and waiting was not serving us, I handled the financing side. I researched lenders, compared loan products, prepared our joint application. Cristobal contributed the down payment from his savings. I contributed the underwriting navigation, the documentation, the follow-up, the rate negotiation. We locked a rate that our lender told us was the best she'd seen from a borrower pair in the prior 6 months. The property itself was a corner lot bungalow in a neighborhood we both loved, 3 bedrooms, a detached garage, a backyard deep enough to have a real table in it. It was in my name and Cristobal's name jointly with right of survivorship. I had reviewed the deed before signing. I had reviewed it twice. We were 3 weeks from closing when the dinner happened. Cristobal's parents had invited both families to their home on a Sunday evening. The intent, as Eduardo described it when he called Cristobal, was a simple pre-wedding family dinner, a chance for everyone to be in the same room without the pressure of a venue or a schedule. I wore a dress I'd bought for the occasion. I brought flowers for Pilar, Cristobal's mother. We were seated around a long table in their dining room. Pilar had made a full meal. The evening started the way those evenings start, careful, pleasant, everyone finding their footing with the small talk. It was my father who changed the temperature. He had been quiet for the first portion of the evening, not unusual. He had a way of going still in unfamiliar social situations, reading the room before engaging. But somewhere between the main course and the point at which the conversation turned toward the house purchase, I watched him shift. I recognized it the way you recognize a weather change you've been living with your whole life, not from any single signal but from the combination of all of them, the way he set down his fork, the way he looked at Cristobal's father rather than at me. He said, "I want to be honest with you, Eduardo, because I think it's important that your family has the full picture." My throat tightened. I set my water glass down. "There are some concerns," he said, "about the deed on the property they're purchasing." Eduardo looked at him carefully. Pilar set down her glass. "Marisol has a history," my father said, "of misrepresenting her role in business matters. Things she's been involved in peripherally she tends to describe as her own work. We've seen it for years." Cristobal's hand found my knee under the table. My father continued. "There's a question about whether the deed was handled correctly. Whether the signatures on the preliminary documents were obtained properly." The word he chose was not forged. "Not yet." My mother leaned forward from her chair. Her voice was a register lower than normal, the one she used when she wanted to sound reluctant, like what she was about to say cost her something. "We don't want to see you get hurt," she told Eduardo. "We don't want to see your son get trapped in a situation he didn't understand." The word she chose was trapped. I looked at the flowers I'd brought for Pilar, still in their paper on the counter. I looked at Cristobal, who was looking at my father with an expression I had never seen on his face before. And then Dante, who had been quiet on the other side of the table, said, "She's always done this. Even as a kid. She takes credit for things she didn't do and then gets defensive when anyone questions it." 3 members of my family. Different words. The same sentence. I did not cry. I did not raise my voice. I folded my napkin into a smaller square and set it beside my plate and looked at my father and I said, "Are you finished?" He looked at me as though the question surprised him. "I'm going to need a few days," I said. To Cristobal, not to the table. "But I'm okay." Cristobal said, "I know." His father said nothing. His mother looked at her hands. And my father looked at the table between us and said, with the same mild organizational concern he had been using on me for 20 years, "I just think it's better that everyone knows the truth." I looked at him for a long moment. There was something in my bag that he didn't know about yet. Not in that room, not that night. But it had been there for 11 days, and in 3 weeks at the closing it was going to matter very much. I picked up my napkin again. I smoothed it across my lap. "Sure, Dad," I said. "The truth." Act 5. The closing was scheduled for a Thursday morning at 10 o'clock at the title company on Meridian Avenue, the same company my father had used for the Callaway Street refinancing 7 years earlier. I had chosen it deliberately. I knew the office. I knew the layout. I knew that the conference room had a long table with enough chairs for everyone who might need to be there. Cristobal and I arrived at 9:40. His parents came at 9:55. My parents arrived at 10 past 10, my father in the jacket he wore to business meetings, my mother a half step behind him with her purse held in both hands. The item I had mentioned to no one, not to Cristobal's parents, not to the escrow officer, not even to Cristobal until the night before, was a manila envelope I had requested 11 days prior from the county recorder's office. It contained a certified copy of the preliminary title report, the transfer history on the property, and the original grant deed bearing the signatures of the seller, the notary, and the two buyers, Cristobal Fuentes and Marisol Navarro. Every signature notarized. Every date confirmed. Every recording number stamped in the county's own ink. I had requested it the morning after the dinner at the Fuentes house. I had not slept well that night. I had lain in the dark going over the specific words my father had used, misrepresenting her role, obtained properly, and I had understood that he had chosen those words with care. He hadn't said forged outright at the dinner. He had said it in the shape of a question, a concern, a thing that responsible people ought to look into. That shape was familiar to me. It was the same shape as she gets confused, the same shape as I don't think I sent that, the same shape as I was going to handle that. The shape of a man who understood that implication carries less risk than accusation and lands just as hard. So I had called the county recorder's office at 8 in the morning and requested the certified copy and paid the fee and driven to pick it up myself, and I had kept it in the manila envelope in the bag I carried every day since, and I had said nothing about it to anyone. Except for one phone call. To a woman I had found through the county recorder's public staff directory, whose title was Senior Document Examiner and whose name I confirmed before I called. I explained the situation briefly, not emotionally, just factually. I told her that a family member had raised questions about the legitimacy of the signatures on a recent deed I was party to, and that I wanted to understand whether the county had any process for verifying authenticity in person. She asked some questions. I answered them. She said she could be available Thursday morning if I gave her the address. I gave her the address. The closing itself began normally. The escrow officer, a composed woman named Helen, walked us through the settlement statement page by page. Cristobal signed where indicated. I signed where indicated. Our signatures were notarized. My father sat at the far end of the table with the expression he used when he was watching something he expected to find wrong. It was Cristobal's father who said it. Eduardo Fuentes, who had been quiet since the dinner, who had looked at his wife across the table that night with an expression that told me he was a man who needed to understand a situation fully before he spoke about it. Eduardo looked at my father and said, carefully, Rodrigo. What you raised at dinner. You said there were concerns about the deed. My father straightened slightly. I said there were questions worth asking. Then I'd like to ask them, Eduardo said. Here. With everyone present. Helen set down her pen. My father looked at me then. Directly, for the first time since we'd sat down. And he said to the table, to everyone at it, the signatures on the preliminary documents. There's a question about whether Marisol obtained them properly. Whether Cristobal's signature specifically was placed there with his knowledge. The word he didn't say hung in the room the same way it had hung at the dinner table. Cristobal said, I signed everything myself. I was present for every signature. My father said, I understand you believe that. I reached into my bag. I took out the manila envelope. I set it on the table in front of Helen and I said, this is a certified copy of the deed and the transfer record, issued directly by the county recorder's office 11 days ago. I opened the clasp. I slid the documents onto the table, the deed on top, the recording stamp visible. Then I looked at my father and I said, there's someone else here who can speak to this. The door opened. She introduced herself by name and title, Senior Document Examiner, County Recorder's Office. She had the professional manner of someone who had been asked to clarify records before and found it straightforward. She carried her own copy of the file. She looked at the deed on the table. She looked at my father. She said, is there a specific concern about this document? My father said nothing. She set her copy alongside mine. She pointed to Cristobal's signature, to the notary seal, to the recording number and the date stamp. She said, this deed was recorded on the date shown. Both signatures were witnessed and notarized. The county's records are consistent with this copy in every particular. Then she turned the deed toward my father and asked, in a tone that was entirely professional and entirely without drama, is this your concern? That these signatures are not authentic? My father looked at the document. He looked at Eduardo. He looked at his own hands. He said, "I may have had incomplete information." Helen picked up her pen and resumed her notes. Nobody spoke for a moment after that. Not Cristobal. Not his mother. Not mine. Eduardo looked at my father for a long time, the careful, measuring look of a man recalibrating what he understood about who he was sitting across from. Then he looked at me, and what was in his face was not pity. It was recognition of a specific kind, the kind that comes when a pattern you've been watching suddenly has a name. Pilar reached across the table and put her hand over mine. The document examiner collected her copy, confirmed with Helen that nothing further was needed from her, and left. The closing continued. We signed the remaining documents. We received our copies. The keys were placed in an envelope with our names on it. My father stood before anyone else did. He straightened his jacket. He said, to no one in particular, "I think there was a misunderstanding." I looked at him. I had thought about what I would say in this moment. Not the night before, not that morning. I had thought about it for 11 days, since the morning I called the county recorder's office, and what I had arrived at was not a speech. It was a list. His own list, given back to him in the order it had accumulated. I said, "You told the loan officer at the Callaway Street closing that I get confused about what I've confirmed versus what I think I've confirmed." That was the fee I had documented in writing and recovered within 48 hours. He started to speak. I continued. "You told Mom in the kitchen when I was 14 that I had been going through your business papers. I had flagged 11 bookkeeping errors in a notebook I bought myself." My mother looked at the table. "You told Dante about the refinancing opportunity on Callaway Street as though it were your own idea. I have the date I pulled the rate comparison. I have the date I sent you the one-page summary. I have the date you told Dante." My father said, "Marisol, you told the contractor I was getting into the weeds when I questioned the membrane warranty. The warranty he quoted was 15 years. The spec sheet said 12. You used a different contractor." I paused. Not for effect. Because I was making sure I had the order right. "You told Eduardo and Pilar that I have a history of misrepresenting my role in business matters. That I take credit for things I didn't do. That your son should be careful about being trapped." I looked at my mother when I said the last word. She did not look up. Here is what I was actually doing during all of that. I was reconciling 12 accounts across 14 units every month without a title or a salary. I was filing your quarterly estimated taxes. I was rebuilding 6 months of expense data from bank statements over 2 weekends because the software failed and I didn't want you to have to deal with it. I was coordinating your lease renewals and vetting your contractors and handling your audit response. And I was writing it down. Every entry dated, signed. I picked up the manila envelope from the table. This is what documentation looks like when someone who actually did the work keeps track of it. I set the envelope back down. I did not slam it. I placed it flat on the table between us. I said, "I think we're done here." I picked up the key envelope with our names on it and handed it to Cristobal. He took it. My father stood with his jacket straight and his hands at his sides and said nothing. Dante, who had come to the closing uninvited and had sat silently at the end of the table since the document examiner arrived, looked at the floor. We walked out into the Thursday morning and the air was bright and a little cold and Cristobal held the door and I went through it first. His mother called that evening. She talked for a long time. At the end of the call she said, "You are not what he described." I thanked her. I didn't say what I was thinking, which was, "I know. I have known for a long time." I kept records. My father called 3 days later. He said he had been operating on information he now understood was incomplete. He did not use the word apology. He did not need to. I understood the shape of what he was offering and I understood what it cost him, and I said, "Okay, Dad," and meant it in the way you can mean something and still know that a thing has changed permanently. Dante did not call. My mother sent a text that said, "I'm sorry I didn't say more." I read it twice and typed back, "I know." Because I did know. I had always known. That was its own kind of grief, separate from all the rest. We moved in on a Saturday 3 weeks after closing. The backyard had a magnolia tree we hadn't noticed when we first walked the property. It was winter when we toured it, the branches bare, and we had missed it entirely. In April it opened and the blooms were enormous and white and they lasted about 10 days before they fell, which Cristobal said was sad and I said was just the timing of magnolias. I think about what I would tell someone who is in the middle of a version of what I lived through, not the closing, not the document examiner, not the specific mechanics of the reveal, but the part before all of that. The 14-year-old with the spiral notebook. The 24-year-old sitting in the chair against the wall. The 30-year-old who started keeping the ledger not out of anger, but out of the need to prove to herself that her own memory could be trusted. I would tell her to keep the records. Not because the records will necessarily save you, they may never be needed, and in a better version of things they wouldn't be. But because the practice of documenting what you actually did, with dates and specifics and your own signature, is the practice of treating your own work as real. It is the practice of refusing to let someone else's version of your contributions become the only version in the room. The records are not revenge. They are evidence that you were there, that you did the thing, that the work was real and the contribution was real and you were real. In the moment when someone in a room full of people you care about tries to make you something smaller than you are, it matters to know, precisely and with timestamps, who you have been all along. My father built his business by understanding that property has value because it is documented. A deed is not ownership, it is the recorded proof of ownership. He knew that better than almost anyone. He just never applied it to people. Some things, once they go on record, cannot be quietly made incomplete. This is true of deeds. It is true of ledgers. It turns out it is also true of what we know about the people we come from. If any part of this story stayed with you, if you've ever sat quietly in a room while someone revised your history for an audience that didn't know better, share this with someone who needs to hear it. The person who keeps the records usually does it alone, for years before anyone else sees them. But someone out there is keeping that notebook right now, and they deserve to know it's going to matter. These stories are fictional and created for entertainment purposes.